if you're not a Christian or a fundamentalist Christian, a creationist, you may not have you may have heard or may not have heard about how giants once lived in this world.
Oh, indeed, we have heard about them. From you and other creationists and biblical apologists who try to convince us of the reality once a long, long time ago. To my audience, bear with me while I comb back over one of Nephilimfree's videos which I previously dealt with in A Giant Conspiracy. While doing additional research into this claim of ancient giants, I happened upon a discovery which I thought was very interesting.
Lots of giant men have been dug up out of this earth then. I sent an email off to a museum which had at one time housed some of these giants found in Native America, which were huge men, 10, 12-foot men. This email went to Nevada State Museum, Carson City, Nevada.
Okay, so giant skeletal remains have been dug up out of the ground in North America. Specifically, Nephy mentions Nevada and Native Americans, but he didn't give much detail. However, I did find some interesting online articles which discussed giants dug up in the early 20th century near a town called Lovelock, Nevada. Could these have been the remains Nephy was referring to?
One of
Nevada State Museum and the Lost City Museum are among other institutions that hold material from that site. I do not see any evidence in our database for pathologies in our collections, such as gigantism. She attached a PDF copy of the museum's records regarding their holdings from Lovelock. Listed were page after page of specimens, none of them very interesting, until I stumbled upon one reported object, a human femur. Do you recall I mentioned earlier that a John T. Reed helped publicize the Lovelock Giants when remains were found in 1931 and reported on that same year and in 1939 in the Lovelock Review Minor? I soon learned that trusting John Reed's scientific acumen was like trusting Nephilimfree's research.
Because I had done some research.
In addition to uncovering giant skeletons, John T. Reed was also the man who unearthed evidence of modern men walking through Triassic mud puddles. Reed claimed in 1917 to have found the imprint of a human shoe in 225-million-year-old rock. Recall also that the pseudoscientific and biblical apologetic websites only report that the 1931 and 1939 newspaper articles gave estimates based on the remains of humans 7 to 10 feet tall. Instead of relying on internet articles to feed me what these newspapers reported, I decided to get copies of the articles myself. I eventually learned that the Nevada Historical Society preserves copies of the Lovelock Review Minor going back to 1909. I wrote to the librarian of the society, and I was kindly mailed copies of both the 1931 and 1939 news articles. I'll admit I was a bit surprised to learn that the stories from the internet were true. Indeed, there were reports that giant human remains were found near Lovelock, Nevada. I'd half expected the articles to say the find was gigantic, and that these New Age and biblical nuts had just confused the wording, and thought that giant human remains had been found. But I was proven wrong. Both articles clearly stated that John T. Reed had possession of some of the remains and had done measurements of a femur which confirmed, for him, a giant of some 7 feet. In addition, measurements from other femurs he'd seen suggested ancient humans of at least 10 feet tall. However, neither the Winnemucca Museum or the Hearst Museum of Anthropology at Berkeley made any mention to me that the human remains that came from Lovelock were anything out of the ordinary. Could Nephilimfree be right? Was it possible there was a cover-up? I looked over the laundry list of items which were received by the Hearst Museum, and there it was, a femur. I'd found a link between the museum's holdings and the news articles from the 1930s. The museum had cataloged the reception of a human femur. The news articles described a femur measured by John T. Reed, but the museum had flatly stated to me that there was nothing unusual, giant-wise, about the Lovelock remains. But the news articles plainly gave the measurements Reed had taken of the femur, 16.5 inches. According to Reed, this would have come from a man which stood at least 7 feet tall. 16.5 inches. Wait. I did a quick check. 18.9 inches. 18.9 inches is the average length of a human male femur. I quickly grabbed the measuring tape from my garage and measured my own femur as best I could while it remained part of my leg. Yep, about 18, 19 inches, and I'm 6 foot even. 16.5. That's a guy who's shorter than me. And what about the other femur the news article reports John Reed possessed, which came from a 10-foot giant? 19.5 inches. Not much longer than my own. Might have come from a fella just a few inches taller than me, but certainly not a giant of 10 feet. So what about the photograph of the giant jaw? Well, when you realize that the modern imprint is not of the jaw, but only of the teeth, and you take the modern casting away from the awkward perspective given them in the picture and superimpose them over the so-called giant's teeth, you quickly discover the photo is an optical illusion. The teeth are roughly the same size. Well, no wonder Berkeley was confused by my hunt for giant human remains from Lovelock. What they have are normal-sized artifacts, nothing out of the ordinary, no evidence of Nephilim, no support of the biblical tale of giants. Now, I don't know if the femur listed in the Hearst Museum's catalog is the same one mentioned in the Review Minor article. In fact, I highly doubt that it is. But that isn't the point. The point is that what human remains the Winnemucca and Hearst museums do have are not evidence of ancient human giants. The point is the highly circulated Review Minor articles reporting the discovery of giant bones actually gives evidence of no such thing. All these pseudoscience and apologetic websites using such material as evidence of human giants are bunk, and folks like Nephilimfree and Karen's Faith should be called out for drawing their research from such cesspools. If they'd taken the time to actually do a tiny bit of research, they would have found even more evidence of the amateurish nature of Reed's approach reflected in those newspaper articles. At first, the articles report that Reed believed the remains to be those of a Neanderthal. Apparently, Reed didn't know that Neanderthals only lived in Europe, Western and Central Asia, and not in the Americas. Upon further reflection, however, Reed came to think the remains belonged to a giant from the mysterious Toltec Indians. The Toltec were a Mesoamerican culture circa 800 to 1000 CE. The later Aztec culture saw the Toltecs as their intellectual and cultural predecessors. However, one of the newspaper articles states Reed believed the Toltec to be of Semitic origin, crossing bloodlines with the Numas of the northern African Berber and the Mayans. How the African Berber and the Mesoamerican Mayans crossed bloodlines, the article doesn't say. And remember that discovery Reed made of a human footprint in 225 million year old rock? The supposed fossil is now nowhere to be found, but photographs of it have some concluding it is merely a broken ironstone concretion, perhaps one that has suffered some erosion. It seems old John Reed had more in common with Ron Wyatt than Louis Leakey, more in common with our own Nephilimfree.